In our base medrash program over the last few weeks, we've been talking about Torah and science, reconcilable and irreconcilable differences. And this past Monday, I spoke about sometimes it seems that Chazal are basing some of their statements on science of their day, which has since been disproved. And the question that has to be dealt with is, did Chazal have a perfect knowledge of the universe, or were there certain areas of science that were hidden from them based upon the era in which they lived? It certainly seems that the latter is correct. It certainly seems that Chazal's knowledge was limited to the time in which they lived. Now, when we're dealing with non-Halakhic issues, that's okay. We don't have to be concerned about that. But what becomes really thorny is when Chazal make Halakhic pronouncements that are based upon their perception of scientific reality, and that later that scientific reality is disproved. And we're going to look at 3 examples tonight that are discussed by some of the classic commentators, and we'll try and make sense of it. And we're going to look at a commentary by Rabbi Aryeh Carmel, which he provides as a footnote in the Michtav Meliyahu, that he quotes from Rav Dessler to try and explain, help us to understand how we understand this. The first Gemara, it has to do with treifos. We know that there are different ways for an animal to become a treifa, and one of those ways is for an animal to become mauled and injured in such a way by another animal to render it with a mortal injury. And the Mishnah, therefore, in Perek Elu Treifos in Maseches Chulin says in source number 1, Elu Treifos ba behema. The following render an animal a treifa when it sustains this kind of injury. One of those things is a drusas hazeh, when it becomes mauled or clawed by a wolf. If a wolf claws a cow or a sheep, then that animal is going to be rendered a treifa, which means that once you know that a wolf has been mauled by a sheep has been mauled by a wolf, then you can't. It's not kosher. Even if you shecht it and the animal is still viable and living and it seems to be completely recovered from that injury, it's rendered a treif and the animal is not kosher. It has to be treated as treifa meat. And so therefore, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Drusas Hazev Bedako, Drusas Ari Bagasi, he qualifies it. And it seems that, at least according to one opinion in the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda is not coming to argue with the Tanakama, but rather he's coming to qualify what the Tanakama means. He means that a wolf, when it mauls a sheep, the sheep is rendered, which is a behema daka, a smaller animal, that animal becomes a treifa. But if it were to maul a larger animal like a cow, the cow would be able to recover and would not be considered a treifa. It's only when a lion mauls a large animal like a bull or a cow that animal becomes a treifa. Now if you take a look at Rashi, and this is Rashi consistent throughout the Sugya, the reason why a wolf renders a sheep a treifa, even when the sheep seems to recover from its injury, is as follows. Shehika b'tzipornav, that the wolf injures with its nails or with its claws, umatil ba'eres, and there is a poison that is on the claws of the wolf, visorfa b'daka, and this is what causes the animal to be poisoned by the poison and basically will cause it a slow death. Aval begasa lo olim zihare lemiklaye. But when it's a larger animal, the poison is not strong enough to consume the animal with this poison, and eventually the animal may recover. Okay, so that's the difference between a wolf mauling a smaller animal versus a larger animal. Okay, now if we take a look at the Gemara's discussion further, there's a much lengthier discussion, but we're just going to pull out a few pieces. This is a Gemara in the end of Daf Nun Beis Amid Beis, and also we'll jump to a piece at the beginning of Nun Gimel Amid Aleph. Amar of Amram, Amar of Chisda, Drusas Chasil Unemiya Begedim Utloim. That when a cat or a marten, which is like a smaller kind of weasel-like animal, when it mauls with its claws, that will render a goat or a sheep into a treifa. Drusas Chulda, but if it's a smaller animal like a weasel, then it's only going to render an oath. That'll render a bird a treifa. Amar of Yosef, naktinan ein drusa lekelev. And our tradition is that only a cat can render a cat, a wolf, a marten, will be able to render an animal into a treifa, but a dog does not render an animal as a treifa. And the question is why? And as it becomes clear from the sugya that a dog does not have poison on its claws, only a cat does. And Amar Abaye naktinan ein drusa ela biyad la'afuke regel delo. Another Masorah that Chazal have is that the only time that the cat's or the wolf's talon will cause the animal to become treifa is if it uses its front paws. But if it uses its hind paws, that will not render the animal a treifa. And furthermore, ein drusa ela b'tziporen la'afuke shein delo. Furthermore, it's only with the claw and it's not with the tooth. The tooth, if a cat takes a bite or a wolf takes a bite out of an animal with its teeth, that's not enough to render the animal a treifa, because again, it doesn't have the poison on its teeth, it only has the poison on its claws. And ein drusa ela midas la'afuke shalom midas delo. And furthermore, the animal, when it claws unintentionally, let's say it falls off a roof and it lands with its talons on a sheep, then that will not render the sheep a treifa. It's only when it maliciously is going to attack, that's when it renders the animal a treifa. And ein drusa ela michayim la'afuke lachar misa delo. And also, if it falls on an animal after it's already died and it sticks its talons in, there will be no injection of poison, and therefore will not render the animal a treifa. And Rashi really says this. And the Dibur Maskell Shalom Midas, if the animal does it unintentionally, and so he explains, the Kevan Shalom Midas Nafal, Kegon Min Hagagal HaBehema, since the animal unintentionally clawed its prey, let's say it fell off a roof, Afal Pisha Niska Atziparno Begaba, even if its claw may have punctured the animal's skin, Ein Mashlich Ba Eres. It does not inject its poison into the animal. And as a result, the animal is not rendered a treifa. So you clearly see from this Gemara that as far as Hilchos Treifos are concerned, the thing that renders the animal a treifa is the poison, and is not the incision that is made, or puncturing that is made into the animal's organs, that renders it a treifa. The question, of course, is scientifically, does such poison exist on a cat's claw? As far as we know from veterinary science today, there's no such poison that exists on a cat's claw. There's no such poison that exists on a wolf's claw. So then the question becomes, if we were able to ascertain that there is no such poison, would the halacha be able to change? And even if the halacha doesn't change, okay, so that's part of the issue. Okay?
Was the belief that the poison would actually kill the behemoth?
Eventually, yeah. The idea of the animal becoming a treif is that it doesn't die instantly, up to a year. Take up to a year for it to die from that injury.
We have to broaden the definition of what poison is. I can't speak to poison in that sense that we think of it, but in clinical practice, cat scratches are very dangerous, and there are certain things that are specific to them that don't respond to other antibiotics. It's actually a bacteria that you only see with that type of an injury.
Fantastic, Avi. Okay, all right. Well, we're gonna come back to that. Good.
But why does it lions and mountain lions with the bacteria on the claws are extremely poisonous?
Okay.
The curious thing is that they tear with their back legs. They hold with their front caps, and they tear with their back legs.
Yeah, and apparently the Gemara says, apparently the Gemara says not that way.
If it was a bacteria, as Avi suggesting, wouldn't it always affect, not just when it wants to inject it? It sounded like
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. Let's keep all those things in mind, and let's go on to the next case. The Gemara now says, so this is a clear halakhic issue that you can see. Is the animal rendered a treifa from poison or not? Let's take a now look at the source number 3, the Gemara in Pesachim. Tanu Rabbanan, Chachmei Yisrael Omrim, B'yom Chama Mehaleches Lamata Min Harakia, Uvelayla Lamayla Min Harakia. The wise men of Israel meaning the rabbis, Chazal, who are involved in scientific inquiry, ask the question, where does the sun go at night? It disappears. So where does it go? And so the opinion of Chazal is that it goes above the rakia. Now what is the rakia? The rakia, as it becomes clear from the Gemara, is an opaque dome that covers our planet. And this opaque dome has the appearance of blue when it is illuminated, just like if you were in a dome and you turned on a light, you would see the surface of the inner surface of the dome reflecting off of the light. Right? So that's the way we get a blue sky, is because our sky is a dome. Now the sun, when it leaves the dome, where does it go? That's really the question. And our sages are of the opinion that if this is the dome and the sun sets in the west, it travels from east to west over the course of the day within the dome. And then at night it comes out of the dome and then goes above the dome, going from west to east, and comes back so that in the morning it's back at the eastern part of the dome and creeps back in under the edge of the dome. That's the way Chazal understood how the sun travels, the trajectory of the sun over the course of 24 hours. However, b'chachmei umos ha'olam omrim, b'yom chama mehaleches lamata min harakia. No, at night, during the day, the sun travels inside the dome. Uvelayla lamata min harakia. It's not that it goes above the dome, but it goes underneath. Lamata min akarka, it goes underneath the ground. It goes underneath the ground. So it travels, leaves the dome, but not to go above the dome, but to go under the earth. It goes under the earth, so it travels this way and then comes back up. Amar Rabbi v'nirin divrein midvarenu. Their words, the words of the other wise men of the other nations, appears to be more correct than our words. Shebiyom mayanos tsoninu v'layla roschem. Because during the day, the well springs are cool, and at night, the well springs become warm. Now, what does that mean? And as Rashi points out, we know that when dawn arrives, you can see steam coming off of the wells. And so that shows that overnight, the well water remains hotter than the outside atmosphere, the outside air. So it must have some kind of heating source that is underground. And so the way that the water remains heated underground is because the sun is directly underneath them, because Chazal also seemingly had a conception, was universal at this time, that we're not dealing with a very, very big planet, we're dealing with a flat planet, and so if the sun goes underneath the earth at night, it's very close to what's underneath our soil, and therefore all water that is in ground is heated by the sun. So both the opinion of the rabbis and the opinion of the other rabbis, of the scientists of the other nations, is both bad science, as you can see. But Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, if I had to choose between one of the two, I would take the other guys, because we have evidence that what they're saying is accurate, in the sense that water that's underground is heated. It must have a heat source, and that heat source is the sun. Now, we know that that's bad science also. We know that that's not the case. We know that the water that's in the wells is not heated. If it is, it's heated by geothermal energy. It's not heated by the sun. And that's number one. And we also know that it's not so much that it's hot, but that it's insulated, so that when it gets cold outside at night, the water that was warmed from being heated by the day sun remains insulated, and so that it remains warmer longer, because it's not exposed to the elements as much. So it's only by contrast to the outer air in the cold morning dawn that you see steam rising off the wells because of the contrast in temperature. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the water has been heated, it just means that it's been insulated. Okay, so these are things to consider. Now, you can say to yourself, there's
who's Rabbi arguing with?
He's arguing with other sages who did scientific analysis and theory, and he basically said, my colleagues, the Chachmei Yisrael, the wise men of Israel, suggested this, He doesn't identify them by name.
Meaning of his generation.
Either his generation or an earlier generation. We have no indication.
So he's engaging in the same discussion we are.
Yeah, that's coming up too. Doesn't it show us that Rabbi himself is saying that you don't really have to...
Correct.
Like
this is a very important point, that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi himself is saying this point. Now the question is, in a vacuum, this is a completely innocuous Gemara. Because Lamai Nafkamina. Who cares where the sun goes at night? We just know it's not there. And when it's not there, it's time to daven Ma'ariv. And when the sun comes back in, it's time to daven Shacharis. Does it really make a difference to us, halachically? So the answer is yes, there is an important nafkamina lahalacha. And this is why this is an important discussion for how to deal with halachic decisions of this nature. Because if you look at the Shulchan Aruch in Hilchas Pesach, when we talk about baking matzahs, there's a certain kind of water that must be used. It's called mayim shalanu. Not our water, but water that rested. What does it mean, water that rested? It means water that was drawn from a well and allowed to remain overnight outside the well. Why is that important? That's what the Shulchan Aruch paskins this way in source number 4. Ein loshin ela b'mayim she'lanu. You may not need, unless you use water that has had a chance to rest. Bein shehein mei boros umayanos, bein shehein mei naharos. And it makes no difference whether this is well water or spring water or river water. The shoavin osami ba'ojom, and the samach lebein hashmashos, the Ramah says, oh, bein hashmashos, you draw it while it is still day or during the twilight hour, and you have to wait until the night completely elapses, and then you can start baking your matzahs. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is a compendium that is already into the 20th century, trying to explain to us why that is. And it's what's shocking to me is that the Mishnah Berurah is living during the time of scientific discovery of the early 20th century, and he's certainly aware of many of the perhaps what we would consider to be fallacies of the ancient world, that the earth is round, and we know where the sun goes at night, and so forth. However, take a look at what the Mishnah Berurah says. Hainu lina b'chli la'achar she'ivasan. So the Mishnah Berurah says you have to put the water in a utensil after it's drawn to leave it out. V'hatam kasav Rashi b'Gemara. Rashi tells us the reason. Shehamayanos b'mei Nisan him chamin. Well springs in the month of Nisan are warmer than normal. Because the trajectory of the sun is such that it is a little bit closer to the horizon over the course of its trajectory over the day. And as a result, it heats the well springs. That doesn't seem to be scientifically accurate, but let's grant for a moment that there is some accuracy to it, that based on refraction and based upon the positioning of the sun, perhaps well water might be able to absorb more energy in the month of Nisan, and so the water would become warmer because of the positioning of the sun. Although I don't know that necessarily is the case. It would seem, I can't tell you one way or the other, I can't prove that to be accurate one way or the other. But it doesn't ring true. I don't think it's true, but perhaps there is some truth to it. V'yesh meforshim, but v'yesh meforshim is even more difficult. He says v'yesh meforshim mipnei shebalayla hachama mehaleches lamata mehakarka umechamemes hamayonos. Because at night the sun goes below the ground, and it therefore heats up the well springs. Uleficha chasru chachamim liishtamish bahem letzorech lisha tekaf mishiyotzim min haaretz. And that's why the sages told us not to use this water immediately after drawing it from the ground, because then it becomes like warm water. And we know that you're not allowed to knead matzah, the flour, with warm water, because that could hasten the leavening process. You have to therefore allow it to cool off in external vessels, so that it cools off. How long you have to wait until it cools off will be explained. Fine. Now, there also you see that there's an afgamina lahalacha. We do paskin, by the way, that if you used well water and did not wait the requisite period of mayim shalanu, that it's not chametz, it's still b'di'evid, it's kosher. But here you have a halacha. And once again, the halacha seems to be based on bad science. It seems that way, at least, because there doesn't seem to be any evidence that well water is any hotter than water that's left out. Now, perhaps you could argue that spring water could be hotter, because spring water could have some geothermal heat that is at its source, and then you could make a low plug. But to say that it's because of this scientific fact seems to be somewhat problematic.
It wouldn't be a seasonal thing.
It could be cooler also.
It wouldn't be a seasonal
Spring
thing.
water could be cooler.
It could be cooler too. It could be hotter and it could be cooler. Okay?
It's nothing to do with the sun.
Right. Correct.
Wouldn't well water retain the heat of the sun from the day longer in the well than if it was taken out?
I don't know. Maybe it would. Maybe it's more insulated. I'm not sure. I don't know. Let's take a look at the Gemara now. The third example. Usha'ar shkatzim. We're actually, source number 6. We'll just skip to the end of the line. Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer Omer. Hahore kina b'Shabbos kahore gamal b'Shabbos. Rabbi Eliezer says that if you kill a louse on Shabbos, that's the singular of lice, it's as if you're killing a camel on Shabbos, because you're taking the life of a creature. So maskef la Rav Yosef ad kamo pligi rabbanan alei de Rabbi Eliezer ela bikina de ina para barava aval shar shkatzim u'ramashim de paran baravin lo kligi. So the Rav Yosef says, why do you have to say this only goes according to Rabbi Eliezer, this halacha of killing a creature on Shabbos? Because only Rabbi Eliezer holds that if you kill a louse on Shabbos, you're liable. The only point of argument between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim is only about the specific species of lice, because the Chachamim are of the opinion that if you kill a louse on Shabbos, you're not liable for taking the life of a living creature, because lice do not procreate in the normal fashion of pru or vu. Lice are generated spontaneously from perspiration. And this was the belief of the medieval world until very recently, relatively recent, until about the 18th century, that there are certain insects that spontaneously generate. Maggots generate spontaneously from fecal matter. Gnats generate spontaneously from stagnant bodies of water. All of these things were the belief of medieval science, and certainly ancient science, and therefore the belief was that lice spontaneously generate from perspiration and are not born from parent lice. And therefore the Chachamim are of the opinion that you're allowed to kill lice on Shabbos. Aval shar shkatzim u'ramashim de paran baravin lo pligi. And they both learn it, and they agree, the Chachamim, that other insects that do reproduce in a normative fashion, you are liable. And the Gemara now says, Ushneim lo lamduha elamei elim. They both learn them out from the elim ma'odomim that were used in the temple to construct the Mishkan, I should say, that the Torah requires you to kill rams in order to harvest their hides. And so therefore one of the malachos that was done to construct the Mishkan was to take a life. And according to Rabbi Eliezer, anytime you take the life of a creature, whether it's a ram or whether it's a louse, you're liable. And the Chachamim say, no, it has to be similar to the ram in that it reproduces through having a parent. But since lice do not reproduce by having parents, they spontaneously generate, therefore you're not liable if you take their life on Shabbos. And this seems to be the most problematic, because whereas before in the previous two examples we're being machmir, and we're saying that any time a cat mauls, it's rendered treifa, and any time you have to use mayim shalanu in order to bake kosher matzahs, that's a chumrah. But here there's a kula. We're basically saying that you can kill lice on Shabbos because they don't reproduce in a normative fashion, and this is codified in Shulchan Aruch, and once again, shockingly, the Mishnah Berurah supports it. So you take a look at the Shulchan Aruch, Parosh Hanikra Bor Ruth B'Lashon Arav. I looked it up in my dictionary. That's why I wanted to make sure I knew exactly what it was. A Bor Ruth is a flea, right? And therefore, asur latsudo ela im kain hu al bisaro va'okso. It is prohibited to trap it on Shabbos unless it is on your flesh and it is about to bite you, or it is biting you. And in any event, va'asur lahorgo. And then the Mechaber continues, we skip the Ramah, aval kina mutar lahorga. But it is mutter lechatchila to kill a louse. Uvehamefalo begadav mikinim lo yahargem elamolon begadav v'zorkan. If, however, you're just wholesale cleaning off your clothes from bugs, you should not kill the bugs because there may be a combination of lice and fleas embedded in your clothing, and therefore, even if you think you can select them carefully, you're not. It's a takonis chachamim that you should not kill them when you're pulling them off your clothing. If you take a look at the Mishnah Berurah, and again, Mishnah Berurah is 20th century, Rabbi say, but he says va'asur lahorgo. You're not allowed to kill a borguth, which is a flea. It says hatam demachalkinan bein parosh lekinahu dechol melachos b'Shabbos mimishkan yalfinan lahen. The reason is because there's a difference between a parosh and a kina, is because all the work that is prohibited on Shabbos is learned from the Mishkan. V'yalfinan misas kol balei chai lechiyuv mishchitas elam ha'adamim shayu b'mishkan b'shvil oroseihen. And like I mentioned, there was one of the work activities that was necessary to construct the Mishkan was to kill rams in order to harvest their hides. And it didn't have to be shchita, it could be any kind of killing, because you weren't harvesting the hide, the animal for its meat, you were just killing it to get its hide. Therefore, and therefore any way that you take a creature's life, you're doing a malacha. V'amrinan ma'ilima odamim sheparim v'ravim, af kol sheparim v'ravim la'afu kekina de'ena ba'a mizachar u'nekeva, ela ba'a min hazeya. And therefore, the difference between a ram and a louse is that a ram comes from a parent, one male and one female, and a louse comes from perspiration. Lo chashiva b'riya. And therefore, it's not considered to be a creature that you're liable for killing on Shabbos. Now listen, by contrast to fleas. Listen, by fleas, what's the contrast for fleas? Avol parosh, afal gav shegam hi eina para v'rava. Fleas also are not the product of parentage. Mikol makom kevin shahavyasa min ha'afar yesh b'chiyus ki'ilu nivra mizachar u'nekeva. Since it comes from the ground and not from perspiration, it's generated spontaneously from the earth and not from perspiration. That's a whole different. That's a horse of a different color, right? That's a totally different story. Now, why is it different if it's spontaneously generated from the earth versus spontaneously generated from perspiration? I can only imagine that it's because when God created animals, He created animals from the earth. And therefore, a parosh is a creation of a creature in the very same way that God created balei chayim, creatures with a soul, with a life. And therefore, it's considered to be just like if it's born from a male or a female. And therefore, even if the flea is seeking to bite you, you're not allowed to kill it, you're just allowed to remove it.
Where did you get this from?
This is a compendium. The Mishnah Berurah is getting this from the Taz. He's getting it from all of the Achronim who comment on the Shulchan Aruch, and basically based on the Rishonim as well.
Why is parentage the chief criterion for whether something is a creature? What's the source of that?
He says, I'm not sure exactly. He says apparently it's because when God created the creatures, He said to them, Pru'ervu. When you look at the story of creation and each animal became a nefesh chaya, became a living creature, then the definition of animation in these creatures was that God blessed them with the ability to procreate. If an animal is not born as a product of procreation, then it's not considered to be the kind of creature that God created during the times of creation.
But it still multiplies.
It's not a period.
It doesn't multiply. Not at all. It doesn't multiply. It's generated spontaneously. Each louse generates by itself from perspiration. It's not that one begets another. That's the medieval science of it.
So you can't base your question with today's science based on some fallacy. You're right.
So, I mean, that means if there were no perspiration,
there would be no lice.
If it
That's
really
right. What do you
did generate that way, you'd have a valid.
That's why, because we have antiperspirant today, we don't have lice. Yeah, okay. Obviously, I'm speaking tongue-in-cheek. Okay? All right, so Rabbi Yitzchak Lamporti from the 18th century tries to tell us that now that we're dealing with a kula, the halacha has to change. There's a much longer tshuva in the Pachad Yitzchak than what I just have here from the small paragraph. I only copied for you a small portion of it, but the Pachad Yitzchak says, the Pachad Yitzchak is an encyclopedic work, just like the Peleiotes, like we talked about, I think last week or a couple of weeks ago, and he goes through different items in the alphabetical order. So this is under the letter Tzadi. He has an entry for Tzeda Ha'asura V'Hamuteres B'Shabbos, the types of trapping that are permitted and forbidden, or forbidden and permitted on Shabbos. And he says, Chiluk bein Parosh Lakina Dezeh Aser V'Zeh Muter Lahargo. He says the reason why you're allowed to kill a louse, but you're not allowed to kill a flea, is V'hu Achiluk bein Harimashim Shein Parim V'Varavim Mizocher Nekeva Onis Havin Min Ha'afar. And this is the difference between animals that multiply or reproduce from a male and a female, or are generated from the earth, and between other insects or creatures that spontaneously generate from dung or from rotted fruit and the like. Visham the Magid Mishnah, he's commenting on the Rambam, Shnei Pirushim al Parosh. There are two explanations about what a Parosh is, whether it's a flea or something else. And the Machaber says it's a flea, it's this border ruth. And Va'aniat Sa'ir HaKosev Ilav the Mistafina Amina. He says, I, the young man, I, the small, who was writing this, were it not for my hesitation, Amina, I would say, the Bizmanenu, Shachachmei HaToldos Hibitu V'ra'u V'yadu V'kostu, that the scientists of our day have looked, have analyzed, have discovered, and have written the Chol Balchai Yihya Misha Yihya Hava Min HaBeitzim, that every living creature, regardless of how big or small, is spawned from eggs. V'chol Zeh Hochichu Berayos Beruros, and they were able to prove this with very clear demonstration, because he's living at a time of scientific discovery. In Kain Shomer Nafsho Yirchak Mehem, V'lo Yaharog Lo Parosh V'lo Kina, V'al Yachnis Asmo B'safek Chiyuv Chatas. And therefore a person should protect his soul, and he should kill, nowadays, neither a flea nor a louse, and God forbid enter into a suffix of having to do a malach and having to bring a korban chatas. Uvadaber hazeh amina, de'im yishmeu chachmei Yisrael rayos umos ha'olam, yachsuru v'yoru l'divreim kemo, de'galgal choser mazal kavua. I say that if the wise men of Israel were alive today and would see the laboratory demonstrations of scientists today to prove that lice are spawned from eggs and not from perspiration, they would change the halacha. Just like we find in our Gemara in Psachim, there was another example of a dispute between the wise men of Israel and the wise men of the nations of the world. What exactly moves in relation to what? Does the sun move and the constellations stand still, or vice versa? It's the same discussion. And he says, you see there that Rabbi said, I agree more with the Chachmei Umos HaOlam than with the Chachmei Yisrael. And so it's the same thing here, says the Pachad Yitzchak. The halacha has to change once the scientific reality has changed, once scientific discovery has proven to us that our premise as to why we're allowed to kill lice on Shabbos is a mistaken premise. However, that's not the way most poskim hold. The Pachad Yitzchak is a das yachid. Everyone else disagrees with him. All of the achronim that are before and after the Pachad Yitzchak disagree with him, and all of the achronim paskin that you're allowed to kill lice on Shabbos.
And it's not just nitpicking.
Oh, very good. You're not just nitpicking, that's right. Now you know where that phrase comes from. I just quoted for you, because of my knowledge of the Kuzari, the irony that the Kuzari lists in a couple of places, but in the fourth essay in particular, he wants to demonstrate the great wisdom of the sages who had a working knowledge of all areas of science, of astronomy, of biology, of zoology, of botany, of horticulture. They knew so much in order to be able to paskin the halachas that they did. And one example, unfortunately for us, is this example of the cat injecting poison with its claws. And he goes through, he says in paragraph 16 from the Kuzari essay 4, paragraph 31, and so in subparagraph 16 he says, what is most amazing is what they said about the animal having to be alive. This means that if after the predator forced his claw into its prey, we then cut off the claw, we do not have to worry about poison. This is because the animal injects its poison only as it separates from its prey and pulls its claws out of the animal. By the way, there are certain stings that are like that. Bee stings are like that, which is why they tell you not to pull out the stinger, because you're just going to get it. Isn't there something with the what is it? The word I'm looking for, that it has those little things on the barbs. The barbs will get stuck. It is with regard to the aforementioned case that the Talmud makes a point of saying that the predator must be alive, despite the fact that it already said that it must claw intentionally. This is to teach that even when it clawed intentionally, but afterwards we cut off its claw, the animal has not received the poison. Okay. Take a look now. This is really the piece that I wanted to get to. Rabbi Aryeh Kalmel of blessed memory was the person who really was the editor of the Michtav Meliyahu, which is now, if I'm not mistaken, it's in 5 volumes. I'm not aware of a 6th volume, although you never know. But when I was a yeshiva bacher, it was only 3 volumes. Then when I was in yeshiva, it came out with a 4th volume, and then later they came out with a 5th volume of the writings of Rav Carmel. So this is from the 4th volume. It's on page 355, and Rav Dessler is writing about different areas of scientific knowledge. And here Rav Carmel tells us about a conversation that he had with Rav Dessler that he wants to record for us. He says, Ra'isi l'rshom kan masha shamati beperush mi pikado shel admor zatzal. I feel it's important here what I heard explicitly from the mouth of Rav Dessler, kishenishal al odos dinam achadim shahata'amim shenitlu lahem einam lefi hametzios sheniskala b'mecher hativ'i b'doros ha'acharonim. When he was asked a question about specific halachos, where the reasons for these halachos do not jive with the scientific reality based upon our knowledge of modern science. V'hareihem ata begeder masha hagemara shoelis bekama makomos v'hachazinon delav hachihu. These dinim would fall under the genre of what Chazal call, we see that it's not that way. We see that it's not that way. So how can you tell me that this is the halacha when we see that the mitzias is not that way? So even Chazalic knowledge that when you see that something is not real, is not true, you can't accept it. So how can we accept these halachos? And he says, Shalosh dugmos nidonu oz. Let's give 3 examples, he says. Aleph, hadiyesh drusa lachatul v'lo lakelev. Shahagemara masbira shezem yishum shahachatul matil eres mitzipornei yadav. That we find that dogs and cats and not dogs inject a poison, and that's why only a cat will render an animal treifa and not a dog. Number 2, hadein lashon amatzos ela b'mayim shalanu v'hatam lakama rishonim lefisha b'layla hachama mahaleches tachas haaretz v'lachein oz hamayanos roschen. That you can't use water unless it's been let to lay out of the well, and the reason is because according to some rishonim, is because the sun goes underneath the earth at night and heats up well water, and you can't use heated up water. And Gimel hadamuta laharokina b'Shabbos mishum shahakina ena para v'rava. And the 3rd one is the case of the louse, that you're allowed to kill lice on Shabbos because they do not reproduce from parents. V'omer admor zatzal shebe'elu u'v'chayotze ba'elu la'olam ein hadin mishtaneh af shelicha'ora hatam eino muvan lanu. So the Rav Dessler gave us a yesod. He says the halacha never changes. Even though the science changes, and the science is the basis for the halacha never changes. So the question is why? Elayesh le'echos bedin b'shtei yadayim bein l'chumra bein l'kula. You have to adhere to the halacha with both hands, which means whether the halacha turns out to be a chumra, like the first two cases, or a kula, like the third case. Udelo kedivrei hari lampronti zal b'pachad Yitzchak erech tzeda asur sheratz lahachmir shalola rokina b'Shabbos kevin shenisparer bizmano belishum safek shekinim parim v'ravam ayidei zachar nekevit k'chol sharbei l'chaim ayin sham. Not like the Pachad Yitzchak wanted to argue that it was discovered during his era that all creatures, all animated creatures reproduce from parentage, from eggs. V'hatam Omer Admor Zatzal ki es ha'halacha yadu Chazal beKabbalah midori dos. Listen to this yesod. He says Chazal, when they stated certain halachos, stated these halachos as a mesorah. They had a mesorah that this is the halacha. The mesorah is that a cat renders an animal treifa and a dog does not, for example. V'gam yadu min hanisayon. They also knew that experience tells us that cats scratches are more dangerous and are more lethal to animals than dog scratches. Lemashal shedursas hachatul alula yoser lamus me'asher drusas hakelef, as I just said. V'shahamayim hanishavim min hamayanos baboker chamim yoser. And they also had experience with the fact that water drawn from well springs in the morning is warmer typically than water that's been laid out overnight. Aval be'inyan hahesberim hativiim. But when it comes to their explanation of these scientific phenomena, lo hahesber mechayev es hadin, ela lehefech hadin mechayev hesber. That it's not that the explanation leads to the conclusion of the law, but rather the law leads to the conclusion of the explanation. In other words, we know the law, and we know the law is true based on experience. And in trying to explain why the reality is such, why the physical reality is such, we offer a scientific explanation based on our scientific knowledge of today. And sometimes that scientific explanation is false, but the halakhic reality is still true.
But does that fit with the last?
Let's see. Okay. V'hatam hamuskar b'gemara ino hatam hayichidi ha'efshari b'inyan. And therefore, the reason mentioned by the Gemara as to why the halacha is true is not the only reason. V'im lif'amim nasnu hesperim shem lefi yedias hateva sheb'yameim chova aleinu lechapes hesperim acherim. If they gave reasons that were only usable based on the science of their day, then it's incumbent upon us to come up with the real scientific explanation, shebahem yiskayim hadin al mechano lefi yedios hateva sheb'yameinu, so that the halacha is defensible based on modern science, not just based on ancient science. Okay, so therefore he goes through the examples. He says, Kach shamat mi bikadosh zatzal. Sa'ad kan are the words of Reb Dessler. Okay, Reb Dessler did not go into an explanation of these three cases, of trying to offer scientific explanations based on modern science for why these halachas are true, but he said that's the basic mahalach. Now, Rav Carmel says to elaborate on what my Rebbe said. Let me go through the three cases. V'alpi yesod zeh nitan lomar lemashal sheha'eres shedibru bo Chazal hu chomer mar'il haksavur b'tzipornei hachatul me'rikavon sheyarei basar mitrafav hakodmim. Abi, you got that? He says that the reason why. What is the poison that Chazal are talking about? It is some kind of poisonous substance that accumulates under the claws or the fingernails of a cat from the rotted flesh of its previous prey. Right? So that would explain the lion as well. That the bacteria that is underneath the nails or the talons or the claws of the cat is what causes the infection and causes the animal to die. And it would therefore, we need to observe that the claw of a cat is inherently different from the claw or the paws of a dog. That's why dogs are so much better than cats. He says because the nails of a cat are actually made up of two parts. Ucheshehachatul dores al menas litrov hu poshet es hatziporin v'hi nichneses el habasar ba'omek. When a cat claws, its claws, what's the opposite of, they extend. The nails extend. Right? It goes, right? Like right? Like Wolverine, right? And that's the way its nails, they come out. Dogs don't work the same way, but cats, this I didn't know. So anyway, and therefore it goes in deeper into the flesh. Ucheshehu sholfa nishar sham min hachomer hamaril v'hu matrif. And when it retracts its claws, the bacteria that was underneath its claws remains in the flesh. And that would explain why, if it doesn't pull out, and if it doesn't do it knowingly, see, a cat has to consciously go, and the claws come out. If it doesn't do it knowingly, and it just falls on an animal accidentally, the things that come out are not going to come out. And therefore the bacteria is not going to go in. You understand? And therefore all of the details of this halacha can be explained thusly. All of the things, that we learned in the Gemara. And also only when it's upset, when the animal gets angry, it goes and it sticks out its, it extends its claws. Extends its claws. Maybe he spoke to a vet. Maybe he spoke to a veterinarian. But that's what makes sense.
He doesn't quote anybody. He doesn't quote any source for you.
This is not a scholarly article, Alan. Why does he have to quote someone? If he tells you this is the way it works.
It's why you
so you either go verify it or disprove it. But just because he doesn't cite someone doesn't mean that it's not accurate.
It's why you hear a dog when it walks and you don't hear a cat.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
The cats usually clean their claws.
No, but their claws are
they're
not
retracted.
They're retracted.
They walk on pads.
Because they're walking.
They walk on soft pads on the ground. Unless they need to.
Okay, listen. I'm not an expert. I can't tell you for sure. But Puk Chazi, go out and find out for yourself. If you want to take issue with this, so come up with. This is correct. Yes.
When people go to the game reserve and they get mauled by animals and or poachers get caught, the thing that they die of is blood poisoning because they get scratched and the claws extend. The bacteria under the claws is extremely toxic. So it's well known in Africa. This is not a big issue.
But it doesn't talk about a chasul here. We're not talking about a lion. We're not talking about a leopard.
All members of the cat family extend. Every cat family.
Yeah.
But the difference is it's the back claws as well. That's why I don't understand why they don't say it's the back claws. And the mountain lion, they use the back claws to eviscerate the animal.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer. And also when it extends its claws or when it retracts its claws, that's when the poison gets in. Okay, so we've explained the cat. He says the water that's been let to stay out all night. We can explain very easily. Why it is that our water, when it's let to stay out at night, it's cooler than water that's drawn from a well. Because over the course of night, the air cools off quickly. And therefore water that's in a pail will also get very cool. But through insulation, water that's in a well does not cool off as quickly. It stays insulated and stays warmer.
Excuse me, this makes sense. Because if the person makes his mutz the first thing in the morning, that's fine. If you make your mutz at the end of the day, the water's heated up already. So what I was going to say is maybe there's something else, not the temperature. Maybe they want to keep it overnight so debris settles out, or maybe, I don't know. It's not. We may be hitting on the wrong
Maybe, but you see, the yesod that he's telling us is that if you don't like this explanation, come up with a different explanation. But the point is that the halacha doesn't change. Right? You got it. Okay, good.
Rabbi, why isn't he concerned then with the Gemara and Avodah Zarah spend a lot of time with snakes injecting poison with the water standing outside?
It's supposed to be covered.
Because that's,
It's supposed to be covered.
what do you mean? So,
Well, he's talking about leaving the water out in
Yeah, but it has to be
covered.
so you just have to put a cover over it. That's fine. Yeah. Umemela baboker me mayano sheshahu b'socha karka alulam lios chamim yosem imayim sheshahu b'layla ba'avir. And therefore, in the morning, he says in the morning, the water from a well that was underground is going to be warmer than water that was let to stay out all night. He says, "Be'inyan hakina hahesber k'tzat yoter kasher." He says, however, yes, Laser.
It seems like he's missing the fundamental piece here, which is that the rotation of the sun and the entire rakia, he's not what he's saying. He's taking the outgrowth of that Gemara and saying, okay, so that deals with, so therefore you have the water changing how.
He's perfectly willing to concede that Gemara is fallacious, it's based on bad science. What he's not willing to concede is a change in halacha. The halacha about Mayim Shalanu is a Masorah, because when it comes to halakhic issues, Chazal made pronouncements not just based upon scientific observation, but also upon a tradition that they had from their teachers. That sometimes the reason Chazal provide is not the correct reason.
Right, so then,
but that in itself is a big chiddush. We have to concede that this is a big chiddush.
But he falls into his own trap, is what he's saying. He falls into his own trap because now he tries to find another logical reason to say why the Allah.
He's saying that it's a mitzvah for us to explain it, right? In other words, drosh v'kabel schar. Try and figure it out. Try and figure out why, even according to modern science, the halacha fits.
The Gemara in itself doesn't say that we have a source. The Gemara itself tries to explain.
Chazal try to offer a reason. So Reb Dessler said that when they try to offer a reason, it's not because that's the reason for the halacha. The halacha is the halacha, and we hypothesize that this is the reason based upon our knowledge of science.
The Gemara says it themselves. The Gemara says Tanu Rabbanan.
But Tana Rabbanan doesn't mean that they told us the reason. It tells us they taught us the halacha. Okay, so the Laos is a little bit more difficult. He says, "Avol haklal yadua she'ein hahalacha mitchashevet ela b'meshem orgash l'chushim." One thing we know for sure: the halacha does not contend with that which is not detectable by the naked senses. Okay, you probably heard this before. Ulefize ulai nitan lomar. Shemikivan shebeitza sakina hiktana ma'od. That perhaps we might suggest that because the egg of a louse is so small, ad shelo hayanitain lir'ota klal b'tkufas matan Torah, that it was not even visible with certain species of lice at the time of the giving of the Torah. Ein ha'halacha mischasheves ima klal. Halacha does not contend with it. In other words, halachically it's not real, even if scientifically it's real. For example, when you drink a glass of water from a fresh river, it's probably the cleanest, most delicious tasting water. But if you had it analyzed, you would find thousands of microorganisms in it. And perhaps even in your tap water there are microorganisms as well. Put it under a microscope and you'll see paramecia swimming all over the place. Does that mean that you're eating bugs? Does that mean that it's usser? No, because they're not visible to the naked eye, and as a result, halachically, they don't exist. In the halakhic reality, the halakhic dimension, they don't exist. In the scientific dimension, they exist. In the halakhic dimension, they don't exist. And therefore, eggs that are not visible to the naked eye, the halacha does not need to contend with. Let's just finish this. And therefore, v'hakina nechsheves kemishava min hachomer shehi gedela bo mevinizones mimenu. And therefore, lice are considered to be spontaneously generated from their source. V'lochein hi nechsheves libria pechusa ve'im badin netilas neshama. And therefore, it's considered to be an insignificant creature, which does not constitute the taking of a life on Shabbos as a problem. We could say the same thing when we talk about insects that grow inside of produce. We know that sometimes what happens is that how do bugs get inside a produce? It's not that they crawled in, but that the parent laid its eggs inside the produce, and then you could have a whole swarm of insects being born inside a pile of grain. Right? So shahabeitza shehitila ha'em l'soch hapri shemimenu nishavu ena niras klal v'nechsheves keila ena b'mitzius. ולכן השרצים האלה נחשבים בהלכה כאילו נסהבו מן הפרי עצמו שגדלו בסוחו ומותרים באכילה כמו הפרי. The Gemara says, we didn't see this Gemara inside, but the Gemara says that as long as the insect was generated from the inside of the produce and did not leave its original station of creation, it's still considered to be part of the fruit and there's no violation of its consumption. Kol zman shelo shartzu al haaretz, as long as it doesn't leave the fruit, and it stays inside the fruit. And it's based on a pasuk. And all other cases like this. And he says, bottom line, Rabbi Say, he says, even if we can't come up with a good reason for these halachas based on our own scientific knowledge today, na'amin be'emunah shalema shehadin din emes. We have to still believe that it's a correct halacha. Ve'el Hashem niyachel, and we have to place our hopes in God. Sheyair einenu limso hesber matim. We have to ask God that He should illuminate us, enlighten us, that we should be able to find a proper reason. Yeah.
So would it be needless to say this to not eat that fruit flower, or would it be the opposite of that?
Well, it depends. First of all, the Pachad Yitzchak did hold that you're not allowed to kill a louse on Shabbos, that you should be machmir. So maybe you could say that it is a midas chasidus to be choshesh for the Pachad Yitzchak. However, I think that there would be those who would argue that it's a chumrah hamevi lidei kula, that it's a chumrah that's going to cause an abuse of the halakhic system, because that means that any time you discover that there's the science that is the basis for the halacha is incorrect, even lakula, you'll say you can take liberties with the halacha. Who needs mayim shalanu, and who needs the cat's claw? I mean, look, a cat scratches my sheep. It's a $500, $400 sheep. I'm gonna sacrifice the whole sheep. Let the sheep get better, and let me shecht it and have it for dinner. So once we start playing games with the halacha, both l'chumra or l'kula, one could argue that it becomes a slippery slope. Yeah.
So where this becomes problematic is by inyoni refuas, right? So if
no, but that's not part of the halachic system. When Chazal prescribe a refuah, they're not saying that that's al pi halacha. They're just giving you medical advice. And if you believe that Chazal's medical advice is based on ancient medicine and not based on modern medicine, you have a right to disregard that. No one will tell you that the halacha requires you to listen to Chazal's medical advice. There's nothing in Shulchan Aruch that requires you to do that.
So because it's not halachic, it's
right.
Just based on the knowledge of their time.
Correct.
Yeah, but that's not so clear. There's a lot of people that will not make that differentiation. And for example, a typical example is a baby who's jaundiced, right? Chazal had fears about that. We now have much more information about jaundiced babies. We know that there's a differentiation between a good jaundice and a bad jaundice. Chazal did not have the differentiation. And you see that in certain communities, the jaundice, for example,
that's an excellent point, Laser.
Is a scary idea, and they will not allow a bris, and they will postpone it zmana.
Yes, but again, that's an example of halachic psak. Chazal paskin that way. Chazal don't paskin medical advice. They paskin that you may not do a bris on a baby that has jaundice. That's in the realm of psak. It's codified in Shulchan Aruch. So again, to suggest, as many have, that Chazal were only addressing a certain kind of jaundice, but most jaundice is what's called physiological jaundice, and therefore it's not problematic, is to take liberties l'kula. Let's say if Rav Dessler's thesis is accurate, let's say there's another consideration that we haven't yet discovered, and it's based on a Masorah. And modern medicine just hasn't discovered the issue yet. There's always that possibility, because we're always discovering new things. And so as a result, it would be, I think, problematic to be makel based upon something that's a halacha psuka, even if it's based on what we now know to be bad medicine. Because it's a cooler. Remember you're suggesting to be makel.
But we see that it is happening in many communities. For
That
example,
that
they're recognizing that the levels that a physician would allow a bris to take place at,
right.
they're starting to move in that direction, and then you'll see that in many Hasidic communities, they will wait and wait and wait much longer. So you see that
that's a chumrah.
But there's some fluidity even in the halacha. In other words, it's not. If it would have been fixed, it would have been fixed. It would have said that this is the number and we don't go beyond.
Yes, but you see, but there's no number given by Chazal. There's no bilirubin count.
Right.
Jaundice is subjective. When you look at a baby, how yellow, cholzas so chama. What does that even mean? So it's a subjective thing. So that's why Mohalim say get a bilirubin count. And I'll be honest with you, if the doctor wouldn't say to the parents go ahead and do the bris, I would tell the parents to wait. But the problem is I don't want to get into a machlokes with a pediatrician. But the fact of the matter is that I think it is important. If the bilirubin is high, even if it's a physiological jaundice, but the halacha is the halacha.